Joining us right now, Minnesota Vikings beat writer for The Athletic. It's Alec Lewis. Hey, Alec, I got to be really honest. Bump and I have been previewing this game all week, and I am a little bit nervous. The Minnesota Vikings look phenomenal this year, but surprisingly, we're not at all expected to be that. What was this year supposed to be about? Like, what kind of conversations were you guys having in August?
Yeah, well, first, thank you guys for having me. The conversations we were having in August would be, how long is Sam Darnold going to play? When will J.J. McCarthy, who they drafted with the number 10 pick, when will he take over? He had looked phenomenal, honestly, in training camp and in his first preseason game. And then J.J. tore his meniscus. It kind of popped up randomly after that first preseason game against the Raiders. And at that point, frankly, the expectations around here were low. I mean, I think the over-under for this team was around 6.5 wins. There was optimism with the staff, with head coach Kevin O'Connell and Brian Flores as the defensive coordinator, and what those guys could do and how they could maybe allow this team to overachieve. But I think essentially the fan base was kind of like, okay, we'll see what happens. This might be kind of a lost year, a transition year. And it has been really, really impressive to see what they've done, to see what Sam Darnold has done, to see what the defense has done. And I think people here have had a blast with this year in a way that's it's been really fun to cover, been fun to watch. It's a very, very, very tight-knit team, a very well-coached team, and they are vying now for the NFC North and the number 1 seed.
Hey, as you know, there are only a few quarterbacks every single year you go into the season and you go, these guys have a legit chance to win the division, win a championship, even if they start off horribly. Well, like Joe Burrow's balling, but at some point they were playing as a team bad football. We're like, well, they got Joe. They should be fine. When did you guys and Vikings fans really start believing in Sam Darnold? When you just bought in and said, okay, he's as good as he's playing right now?
I think for me, the point was probably about a month ago in Chicago in overtime. The Vikings they were winning the game for the majority of the game. Chicago storms back at the end. They got an onside kick. It was almost a terrible collapse for the Vikings, and the game went to overtime. Sam Darnold in that overtime period goes 6 for 6 for 90 yards. Was threading the ball in all over the field to T.J. Hockenson at tight end, to Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison. And at that point, for him to do it late in the game in that type of moment, that was kind of validating. But the reality is, I mean, I believe the week before, the Vikings were in Nashville, and he displayed some pocket movement stuff there. Even earlier in the year, I mean, week 1 against the Giants, he looked solid. So I'd say, you know, there was optimism even in training camp, coming out of training camp, there was optimism. And through the early part of the season, there was. And I laughed, and I still do often, at people who were like, man, when is Sam Darnold just going to come back to down to earth and be Sam Darnold? And I'm like, well, that's assuming that he's going to come back down to earth and have Adam Gase as his coach all of a sudden, and not have Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and not have the offensive line that he's had. So to me, I think, you know, we talk so much about quarterbacks in this league, and I really understand it. They are the superstars. It's the most important positions in sports and in this society probably, but I don't think we put enough still in terms of the importance of and the impact of the infrastructure. And that's coaching, and that's skill players, and that's offensive line, and that's environment, really. And so I think that stuff is just paramount when we talk about these guys beyond just their own play themselves.
Hey, I listened to a couple different podcasts that did this exercise, and I just thought it was a really fascinating one for contending teams, which the Vikings certainly are. And it was, hey, for all these really good teams, they looked at the Lions, they looked at the Bills, the Vikings, teams that had just really either overperformed or were just really dominant. And they said, okay, if I have to isolate a red flag, like what would cost this team in the playoffs, and what red flag would somehow pop up? And the point was, you know, for a team like the Vikings to go, okay, you've been really good, but where's the Achilles heel? So I'll throw the question your way. They've obviously at 12-2 been phenomenal, but where's the Achilles heel?
Yeah, to me, it's probably at the interior of the offensive line. I believe there was a statistic last week that I spotted on Next Gen Stats or NFL Pro, where it was like the Vikings interior of the offensive line had given up 140 pressures this season, which was the most in the NFL. And I mean, as you guys very well know, I mean, there's Leonard Williams over there, so you guys know it integrally. But I think a lot of these NFC playoff teams have serious talent on the interior of their defensive line. I mean, whether it's Tampa Bay and Vita Vea, whether it's the Eagles and Jalen Carter, whether it's the Rams and Kobe Turner or Braden Fisk, whether it's the Commanders and Deron Payne and Jonathan Allen, like all of these teams that the Vikings could ultimately match up against, even the Packers with Kenny Clark and Devontae Wyatt, like they have serious talent on the interior defensive line, and that will complicate things for the Vikings interior, the offensive line. And I will say, like, the Vikings staff does a very, very, very good job working around protection, being very mindful of protection as they game plan and design the offense for each of these games. But at some point, like, the players make the plays. And so that's the spot that I've watched. And then other than that, I would just say, like, the turnovers, they've mitigated them in the last 4 weeks or so, but early in the season, this team was turning the ball over at a pretty high clip. And I say it all the time, it's the most important predictive stat to winning. So that's what I'd say. But I think it's a great question.
Speaking of turnovers, Vikings are +8 in the turnover differential. And the first thing I do as an offensive guy is I scout the defense. Last week I looked at the Green Bay Packers, and that defensive line was better than I thought. This week I look at the Vikings, and I describe the second and third level as like Flight of the Bumblebee. Like, these dudes are flying around to the football. How has there been such a change in this defense? Last year they weren't so great in the turnover department. This year they're in the plus range. What is it? Is it Brian Flores is kind of getting that message across? Is it personnel? What do you think is the key to this?
Yeah, personnel is where I'd start. I mean, the Vikings, and it's a fascinating team build and kind of progression. But when Kirk Cousins departed before in free agency, and Daniil Hunter as well, who's been a phenomenal pass rusher this year for the Houston Texans, the Vikings had some money to spend, and they identified a bunch of guys that they brought in: Jonathan Grenard, Andrew Van Ginkel, Blake Cashman, Shaq Griffin, Stephon Gilmore, Jerry Tillery. All of these, Jihad Ward, all of these guys were free agent signings pretty early in the free agency period, and they've all performed to their valuation of what they were paid, if not beyond that. And so in terms of the turnovers and kind of how, I mean, flying around the way that you identified and noticed, to me, it starts with the pass rush. I think they've been able to get more pressure with a four-man pass rush with Jonathan Grenard and Andrew Van Ginkel, and I think that's been huge. The less time the quarterback has to throw, the less time the secondary has to cover. And then I also think, I mean, beyond the personnel, they have, like, I remember sitting before the season and I watched film with Harrison Smith, who's a longtime safety, potential Hall of Famer here. He's still playing at a very high clip. And we were sitting in a meeting room up on the third floor of the Vikings facility, and on the whiteboard kind of in front of him as we were watching some film together, like, the number one priority on the whiteboard is, like, be all about the ball. And so they have done everything they could possibly do every day within drills to prioritize turnovers, to prioritize punching the ball loose, to just value interceptions as much as possible. And so I think it's been a kind of just a pair of better personnel, very sharp scheme by Brian Flores, and then just the turnovers being such a priority. And it's been massive in their record right now at 12-2.
Is there a matchup you're especially curious about when these two teams meet Sunday?
Yeah, I mean, every week the Vikings play football, I'm so fascinated to see just how the opposing defense tries to defend Justin Jefferson. It is a question every single week of, will they man him up? Will they shadow him with one specific corner? Will they bracket him? Will they play cloud? If they allocate two defenders on him, does that mean Jordan Addison is one-on-one? Because Jordan Addison has produced to an exceptional level this year. I also am fascinated by this, specifically with this game, because as you guys know better than I do, Devon Witherspoon, Tyreek Woolen, these guys are long and they're physical corners. And I'd say one way to limiting Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, is to be physical with those guys. So really, for me, it's how Mike McDonald tries to limit Justin Jefferson, how much split safety, two high safety they play. All of that to me is an every week fascination because these guys are very, very, very hard to defend. And I have a lot of respect for Mike McDonald. So I'm just fascinated to see how he goes about that this weekend.